Hello, my name is Jared Hanleman, and I am going to present to you today on a topic from class throughout the semester that I found interesting and related to my previous research and current research that I do on point process models, PPMs, and kernel density estimates, KDEs, within fisheries movement, specifically the applications in understanding spatial patterns and habitat usage. So that is an Atlantic tripletail on the left, a sturgeon on the bottom, and a blacktip shark on the right. So just to do some overview on these models before we get into the nitty-gritty of each and single one of them. So why does spatial analysis and spatial movement matter? So within fish and shark movement, their patterns are very key in understanding habitat usage, migration, as well as behavior and feeding, so on and so forth. And these insights are very critical for effective conservation and fisheries management, especially when a lot of anglers are targeting them, making regulations at a state or federal level. That bottom left-hand figure there is whether that's not a fish figure, but that is a terrestrial wolf and elk figure. That left side of that figure are Mongolian wolves and movement tracks of elk on that bottom right-hand side using point process models with a map on where their home ranges were and specific movements from a study in 2021. What are point process? They analyze a lot of spatial distribution of points using telemetry. They also use frequencies of observing individuals and build probabilities of sites or habitats being used. And changes in probabilities can reflect immigration of more individuals and emigration of less individuals over a certain time span. They can be useful in providing insights on how environmental variables influence spatial behaviors, such as risk zones, foraging, or aggregation. Kernel density estimates, on the other hand, they smooth location data to visualize areas of intense use, such as home range, very useful for protection or management by understanding these core habitats. That middle figure is from a study, kernel density estimate of a species showing it's highly active and sporadically active. And you can see the peak in that sporadically active line compared to the highly active over that smaller density and time period. And the applications, you can ask a lot of questions with these models. Are there overlaps between species and human activity? How do fish or sharks respond to dynamic environmental conditions, as well as terrestrial animals? So let's break it down per model. So what are point process models, or PPMs? These are statistical tools used to analyze spatial distribution of animals, mainly marked animals, over a series of time, and can be used in a form of generalized linear or hierarchical models and modeled as those, and on a Poisson distribution. Their key features include spatial point data, incorporating environmental covariates, and aggregation. A lot of studies use these in fisheries for habitat selection, interaction mapping, and aggregation studies. That middle figure is just to show what a map of a PPM would look like with specific points and a landscape. So what are some applications? So like I mentioned before, acoustic telemetry data to identify spawning sites of groupers can be an example. For habitat selection, modeling shark movement and its response to water quality parameters or prey availability. Risk mapping to understand bycatch risk of pelagic species. And in spatial analysis, how does a whale shark move in response to plankton blooms, since they mainly feed on krill and small organisms. That middle figure also shows a map of movement compared to each spot on that map is designated by a certain area or color that was made in GIS. So now what are kernel density estimates? Kernel density estimates are a non-parametric statistical method used to estimate probability density of data points and help understand visual of groups or specific individuals. It's used in a form of bandwidth selection, so the level of something of smoothing is controlled by this bandwidth, which affects the resolution of that density estimate. And the heat map output is usually visualized where warmer colors represent higher usage of intensity. And these are better options for describing the probability of an animal locations, which then can be used to infer movement, selection, and etc. A lot of the applications of this include home range analysis, core use areas, hotspot comparison between species, age classes, or even sexes. That middle figure is from a study of kernel density estimates of a demersal fish on Schultz Bank, represented by this study for spatial patterns of a sponge species using a autonomous underwater vehicle. So some applications include mapping core use areas for foraging, rest, or nursery grounds, or quantifying overlap between species and humans. This case study here are kernel density estimates of 3 reef habitats in northwestern Australia, showing lagoon slope and mesophotic ranges of each of these species based on length on the x-axis and its density on the y. So by looking at these, their purpose, data, and output and complexity, PPM's purpose is to identify spatial drivers, requires point locations, its output surfaces probabilities or density maps, and is higher and requires more modeling. Kernel density, quantifying the intensity of the space use, uses point locations only. A lot of heat maps of spatial intensity are the output, and it seems easier to implement. Data software for both of these models, at least for the data, a lot of GPS tracking, acoustic telemetry data sets, and environmental data sets, such as water quality parameters, such as temperature and salinity, and a lot of acoustic telemetry data on these species, of pelagic species especially, can be used to understand movement and habitat use. R is a great component for this. SpatStat is a software package that made that figure in the center here. GIS helps a lot of the heat mapping with overlaying long and lat, as well as specific geographical locations of species. And kernel density estimates for home ranges can be used by, if this is correct, 8 habitat R and KS, as per researching online or packages that are used for that. Some applications for each though. So this is a study on the movement patterns and habitat use of tiger sharks across autogeny in the Gulf of Mexico. This is a map of core habitat areas of tiger sharks, a result from 50% of the kernel density overlap. That map A in the top is the estimate overlap relative to the bathymetry, which are those black lines, and large habitat features such as gas platforms are those black dots. That map B shows yellow dashed boxes, which are the shelf edge or hotspot areas off the Texas-Louisiana coast. And C shows adjacent banks and the Mississippi-Alabama shelf as well for the movement of habitat of the tiger shark in those habitats. But it also shows in this study that by tracking many males and females of varying life stages in the same region, that they observed sex and size specific differences in distribution and movement rate. This study uses point process with modeling oceanic habitats of pelagic species, kingfish and dolphinfish, using recreational fisheries data. So here is spatial prediction of kingfish across seasonality. So to predict the distribution of both, they use the point process model for each species with a binary response variable of pseudo-absence points. And this was implemented using a downweighted generalized mixed model with a Poisson distribution. Some challenges, though, with these models include the accuracy and reliability of these point data sets, and it's very crucial for both, as well as environmental variability and dynamic conditions such as water temperature, salinity, and current. Some future directions this could go: the integration with machine learning, dynamic environmental data integration, applications to fisheries management, and marine protected area design. A lot of these can be implemented for fisheries managers, such as with the growing importance of biodiversity conservation. You can apply these models to design a more effective spatial conservation strategy, understanding high areas of ecological importance such as breeding or feeding grounds, and ensuring they cover critical habitats for highly migratory species. So summary and main takeaways: both models are powerful tools and are a quantitative way to examine how animals use space, select habitats, and interact with their environment. The PPMs help understand aggregation and behavior and are ideal for understanding habitat selection and the effect on environmental variables to movement. Kernel density estimates help map and visualize core areas or hotspots of migratory corridors and activity across a certain landscape. And by combining both these models, you can understand a comprehensive insight into how these factors drive movement of pelagic or inshore species over time. So these are the references for some of the research that was used for examining both models. And I appreciate your time. And if there are any questions, feel free to contact me. Thank you very much.